If you're unwilling to confront a difficult reality about human relationships, you may want to stop here. What follows is not a romantic fantasy. It is not about ideal love or fairy tale endings. It is about perception, emotional leverage, and the shifts that occur when one person finally decides to walk away. When a man genuinely withdraws, not as a tactic, not as manipulation, but as a conscious decision, the impact is often deeper than people realize. The first thing affected is not the heart, it is the ego. For a long time, he showed up consistently. He invested his time, attention, and effort. He remained present even when his presence was no longer appreciated. He carried conversations, maintained connection, and kept the relationship alive when the balance had already begun to fade. Gradually, without noticing it, he became something predictable, something reliable, something always available. And when consistency is no longer valued, it often becomes invisible. The distance rarely appears overnight. It emerges through subtle changes, less enthusiasm, less appreciation, less respect. Not necessarily because feelings disappear, but because the possibility of losing someone begins to feel impossible. Once a person is seen as permanently available, their value can quietly diminish. Eventually, a realization occurs. The man notices that he is giving far more than he is receiving. More importantly, he recognizes that he has started to lose himself in the process. At that moment, he chooses to reclaim his energy. He stops initiating. He stops chasing explanations. He stops making himself constantly accessible. And then comes silence. Not the silence designed to provoke attention, but genuine absence. This is where the dynamic begins to change. When his attention disappears, the loss is not only relational. A familiar source of validation is suddenly gone. The shift is felt before it is fully understood. There is an emptiness that cannot be clearly defined, yet its presence is undeniable. For someone who had grown accustomed to his attention, the change creates confusion. The routine expectation that he would always be there no longer holds true. The first reaction is often not heartbreak. It is performance. Suddenly, everything appears brighter. Social activity increases. New photos appear. New experiences are displayed. Happiness becomes highly visible. From the outside, it can seem as though nothing was lost at all. Yet beneath the surface, much of this behavior serves another purpose. It becomes a way of testing whether influence still exists. As long as he watches, reacts, comments, or shows signs of emotional investment, the connection remains alive. His attention continues to validate the position she once held. The goal is not always reconciliation. Sometimes, it is simply confirmation that the emotional pull is still there. This is where many people make a mistake. Curiosity takes over. They check profiles. They analyze every post. They search for hidden meanings. They react emotionally and break the silence they worked so hard to create. But when the silence remains intact, something unexpected happens. The reflection disappears. Without that reflection, there is no longer a reliable way to measure influence. No reassurance that the emotional connection remains under control. The certainty that once existed begins to weaken. And in its place comes uncertainty. Questions begin to emerge. Is he truly gone? Has he moved on? Was his absence temporary, or is it permanent? Is he happier without this relationship? These unanswered questions often carry more weight than any argument ever could. Arguments maintain engagement. Silence creates the possibility of loss. As the reality of that possibility grows stronger, the internal tension increases. The narrative of control becomes harder to maintain. For the first time, there is a genuine need to confront the idea that the relationship may actually be over. And when ego becomes involved, the response is rarely calm. The next stage is often resistance. The tone changes, frustration appears, messages become more emotional. Old issues are suddenly revived, blame surfaces, accusations emerge. The story itself may even be rewritten. Moments of neglect become evidence of betrayal. Lack of effort is forgotten, responsibility is shifted. Not always because of deliberate dishonesty, but because people naturally seek interpretations that protect their self-image. The objective is often the same: provoke a reaction. Any reaction. An explanation. A defense. Un argument. A justification. Because every response reopens the connection. Every response proves that emotional access still exists. This is why the stage can be so challenging. It targets the desire to be understood, the need to correct misunderstandings, the urge to defend one's character. Yet remaining centered requires resisting that temptation. When there is no reaction, no argument, and no attempt to explain, the strategy loses effectiveness. The emotional intensity begins to fade. And then another shift occurs. The tension softens. The hostility decreases. The resistance weakens. Not necessarily because complete understanding has been reached, but because the previous methods failed to restore the old dynamic. And it is at this point that the most subtle and often most deceptive phase begins. Nostalgia. Then something unexpected happens. You are no longer viewed as the problem, you become the memory. The communication that follows is rarely direct. It doesn't arrive as confrontation or confession, instead it appears subtle, almost harmless. A message about an old moment. A reminder of a shared experience. A casual mention of a place that once meant something to both of you. On the surface, it feels spontaneous. In reality, it is often carefully timed emotional recall. The approach has changed. The goal is no longer to push you into reacting through conflict. The goal is to draw you back through emotion. Only the best parts are presented. The laughter, the connection, the moments that felt effortless. The difficult conversations, disappointments, and emotional distance are left out of the picture. What remains is an edited version of the past designed to awaken attachment. And that is why this stage can be so powerful. It doesn't challenge your reasoning, it challenges your emotions. It encourages questions. Maybe things weren't that bad. Maybe I was too harsh. Maybe there was still something worth saving. Maybe the person I miss is still there. But clarity requires remembering the entire story, not just the highlights. What is being offered in these moments is often not the full reality of the relationship. It is a carefully selected memory, chosen because it has the strongest emotional impact. And if you respond without understanding that distinction, the cycle can begin again. The issue is not the message itself. The issue is what your response confirms. The moment you reopen emotional access, you communicate that the connection remains available. The influence that once existed is restored. The dynamic that seemed finished can quietly return to its previous form. This is why the moment matters so much. Not because ignoring someone is a victory, but because understanding the difference between genuine change and emotional reaction is essential. Real transformation is not demonstrated after losing someone, it is demonstrated before they leave. It appears in consistent effort, accountability, respect, and willingness to address problems while the relationship is still intact. If those qualities were absent before, temporary emotional expressions afterward do not automatically prove growth. And if you remain grounded, if you hold your decision without hostility or resentment, something revealing eventually happens. The performance ends. The strategies fade. The attempts to provoke a reaction lose their purpose. And in that space, reality becomes visible. Not through words, but through behavior. You begin to see whether there is genuine accountability or simply emotional need. Whether there is authentic growth or merely fear of losing control. Whether there is sincere intention or only discomfort with being unable to influence you anymore. Because when influence disappears, only two possibilities remain: authenticity or withdrawal. More importantly, this process gives you back something greater than the relationship itself. It gives you back yourself. You stop chasing approval. You stop negotiating your worth. You stop measuring your value through another person's attention. And you learn one of the most important lessons in relationships: strength is not found in making someone stay. Strength is found in being able to leave without abandoning yourself. That is where true closure begins. Not in convincing another person to understand you, but in understanding yourself. Eventually, a different kind of clarity emerges. You see the relationship without idealization, without excuses, without the urge to rescue something that was steadily draining your energy, and you realize that the problem was not necessarily a lack of love. Often, it was a lack of structure. Love without respect becomes exhaustion. Affection without boundaries becomes dependency. And constant availability without appreciation eventually becomes invisible. Many people believe the solution is to give more, to try harder, to wait longer, to endure more. But effort alone does not repair what is fundamentally unbalanced. What is not respected rarely improves. What carries no consequences tends to repeat itself. That is why your silence was never about punishment. It was about boundaries. It was not an attempt to bring someone back. It was an attempt to return to yourself. Once you understand that, another person's choices lose much of their power over you. If they return, you evaluate them differently. If they don't, your sense of worth remains intact. Because your focus has shifted, you are no longer searching for validation. You are evaluating compatibility. You begin asking a different question. Not, how can I make this work? But, does this actually work for me? And that single question changes everything. For the first time, decisions are no longer driven by fear of losing someone. They are guided by self-respect. That shift influences every aspect of your life. The way you communicate, the standards you maintain, the behavior you tolerate, the explanations you no longer feel obligated to give. People notice when someone stops settling for less than they deserve. And that is where an interesting paradox often appears. When you stop pursuing relentlessly, others become more interested. When you stop seeking approval, your value becomes more apparent. When you stop forcing outcomes, respect often increases. Not because you became someone different, but because you stopped abandoning your own standards. And if a former partner returns at this stage, the situation is no longer the same. You are no longer operating from emotion alone. You are operating from awareness. You pay attention to actions rather than promises, consistency rather than intentions, patterns rather than words. And if meaningful change is absent, you recognize that another chance would simply recreate the same outcome. Not because of pride, because of alignment with what you have learned. Returning to a familiar pain after gaining clarity is not an act of love. It is an act of self-neglect. The deepest lesson is not about understanding the other person. It is about understanding yourself. Why you tolerated certain behaviors, why you stayed longer than you should have, why obvious warning signs were ignored. That is where real growth occurs, because if those lessons remain unseen, the pattern simply repeats itself with someone new, different face, different circumstances, same ending. But when the pattern changes, everything else begins to change as well. The people you attract, the relationships you build, the standards you maintain, you stop connecting from need. You connect from choice, and that difference transforms everything. This is not about blaming another person. It is about personal evolution. Sometimes losing a relationship that consistently failed to honor your value is not a defeat at all. Sometimes it is a correction, a necessary experience that forces you to strengthen your character, raise your standards, and stop begging for what should be freely given. And when you reach that level, relationships become simpler. No games, no tests, no endless attempts to convince someone of your worth. The right person does not need to lose you before recognizing your value. They choose you willingly. They respect you consistently. They appreciate your presence while they still have it. That is the standard worth pursuing, not recovering what walked away, but refusing to accept anything that requires you to lose yourself in order to keep it. And eventually, all unfinished questions disappear, because you finally understand the lesson hidden beneath the entire experience. It was never truly about the other person. It was about how long you were willing to ignore yourself before finally choosing your own worth.